Welcome to the King's Table, a podcast out of King's Hill Church in Boston, where we seek to elevate the Bible over opinion to the questions you have. I'm your host, Jonathan Mosley. Today we have with us Rachel Gammal. She's a member of King's Hill Church, graduated from Emmanuel College. And we have RJ Voorhees. He was a pastor in Columbia, South Carolina, doing college ministry, and now is in Tuscaloosa as a college pastor. Guys, thanks for coming on board today.
Thanks for having me.
Excited.
Rachel, since you're a member of King's Hill and many folks will be tuning in, part of our church, how did you get connected to King's Hill?
I feel like it's kind of a strange story, but then again, I feel like all of our members have strange stories as to how they found King's Hill. I was going to a church in Watertown, like just outside the city, and it was really far from campus. It was maybe 3 miles, but it took over an hour and a half on like 3 different buses, which I didn't mind, but nobody wanted to come with me. So I started praying about a church that was closer to campus, but wasn't actively looking. And then I was on Facebook one day, and my friend Caitlin posted that she was praying for Mission Hill and tagged you and Chelsea in the post. So I did my millennial stalking. I Googled your name, found your email, sent you an email, said, hey, why is she praying for you? And that was right before you guys were about to launch. So my first Sunday was King's Hill First Sunday, and I loved it and stuck around ever since.
That's great. RJ, man, I've been so blessed to have our paths cross being, in college ministry. And, you've served now in 2 different contexts, at least that I'm aware of. As you have really gone neck deep in the college ministry, what's been some blessings that you've seen as you equip and love on students, as you equip them and then see them sent out?
I think it's really just when they flourish, because you realize it's not necessarily anything that you've done to see them flourish so much as just being able to have the privilege of investing in them. And it's kind of that moment when the light goes off, and they're like, oh, I get this. I want my life to be about this. And my vocation can be about this, no matter what my vocation is. And my context can be about this, no matter where my context is. And so for me, that's been the biggest wins. And I know some of your members are some of those students. And just having a chance to be like, wow, it's kind of the idea that you want to send your best and then hope that they outshine you, right? That happens all the time because it's pretty easy to outshine me. But when you have quality people like the Ers and even Thomas and others that that's just a privilege, It's just like, all right, I get to be a part of this and have the privilege of investing and then just seeing them kind of run and multiply. It's really an incredible thing.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I just thinking about we've had students connect to our church out of where you served in South Carolina, and I think we're going to be having some students connect to our church now coming out of your ministry in Alabama. And I think that's just a testimony, RJ, to your leadership and the way you love students and equip them to take the gospel wherever they go. I'm encouraged to have both of you guys today. Really want to talk about, hey, how do we stay spiritually strong if we're a student when we go home? Things change, going from campus back to home life. I just want to be able to have a conversation about how do we stay spiritually strong when we do go home, whether that's spring break or summer. There's just a lot of things to talk about there. So, Rachel, starting with you, what makes going home hard? And thinking about what makes it hard, what would be some encouragements as people do go home in the summer and various breaks? How would you speak into that?
Well, I would say it's weird and confusing first, and then it can become hard because a healthy family is by nature relatively dependent on one another. You're sharing resources, you're sharing a home, and then you move out and you go to college, and all of a sudden you're buying like single servings of things, and you're managing your own schedule, and you're checking in with home, but you're not saying goodnight to everybody at the same time every night. And then you go back to visit, and it's like a momentary transition back into that family unit. So I think, like, at least in my experience, I had to recognize that I've changed, even if it's only after your first semester of college. I had changed and my family had changed. It wasn't just me coming home, reinserting myself into the family that I left when I left high school. They've created a new life. Even like, this is amusing to me, but this past time that I came home for quarantine, I was leaving the house with my mom, and she turns around and she goes, Kesa, and my dad goes, Dia. And I was like, when did we start doing that? Like, when did we become like the quesadilla family? I don't know. But things like that, little things, they just change, they adjust. So I think showing up and knowing that I have to enter my house with humility and I have to be prepared to communicate and allow them to communicate with me. So it's not just, hey, here's all the fun stuff I've done at college. It's asking them questions about their life. And two of the passages that I found super helpful in college and still now, Philippians 2 and James 1, just talk about why we should be entering every situation with humility and how to communicate. So listening first, not immediately responding with my first thought. But I just think at the end of the day, like anytime there's a separation for any reason, people are changing on both ends. So just recognizing that when you come back together.
Yeah, that's really good. Just entering every situation with humility. That's great. RJ, what would you say? What makes going home hard for students?
I'm going to try to come at this from both angles, because I'm not so old that I can't remember going home during the summer. But there was a time right out of college where some of my plans kind of changed forcibly. And so right after I graduated, I had to move home, which is something I swore I never would do. And so even then, it was just that same tension that she mentioned of I kind of feel like I'm my own person now, right? I mean, you guys raised me well, you sent me out well, and I've actually developed into my own person. And now I'm being kind of forced back into some of your schedules for me, even though I'm a 21-year-old. So why are you asking me where I'm going tonight? Like, do I really have to have your curfew hours now? And so understanding that, I like that she mentioned humility. I think that that's a huge thing. And I'm also kind of trying to think about this from a college pastor perspective for freshmen going home again, especially during this quarantine, hearing some of that, like the shock of freshman year being cut short and then being thrust back into their familiar context after
Mhm.
familiarizing themselves with our context here in Tuscaloosa, and just the newfound independence that they had already formed. Like some of the personality quirks that are coming out in them because they're being formed into who we think that they're going to be. Um, and how that plays into the dynamic, of getting back to your home. And I think some other aspects play into that. What is your family context? Are your family members believers? Are they not? We have a number of students who came to faith their first semester here this year, which was awesome to see. But their parents aren't believing. Their family members aren't believing. So what does that look like going back into that context and that humility? Man, that was a great word, Rachel. So thank you for that. But also seeing how your parents may not know how you've grown, right? Like what you've experienced, what pains you've gone through, what friendships have broken, what friendships have formed, how that shaped your perspective, how you've been challenged in class. Some of these things that are like stretching your mind as well as your heart. Um, and so just being able, and I thought she was also wise in talking about how to communicate that. you know um, Listening first is big, because I think we have the tendency, especially as you're exiting your home, thinking, man, I'm done, thanks, and then coming back in like, oh, we're not done. So you're a person and now we're both adults, right? So you're still my parents, but we're adults. So how does that dynamic change? Well, communication changes. It becomes a place of like, how can we grow together in this? And
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know, man. That was always the struggle for me was, okay, I am my own person. I've had my own schedule, especially right out of college, coming back kind of forcibly. I see that similar to this situation of I had to be humbled. It wasn't me going in with humility. So I'm glad that she's approaching it that way. But I had to be humbled. And my dad pretty much, doing the dad voice to me as a 21-year-old, being like, you're disrespecting your mom. You're doing these things. So that's kind of one thing that I've been able to talk with a few of our freshmen, especially during this, is how's that transition been? How have you been communicating with your parents? I know you don't want to be there right now. I know that you have all these experiences that you missed out on, but how can you even minister to your family? You know?
Yeah, great word. Being able to take that mentality of Christ back home and letting our relationship with Jesus
Mhm.
influence and inform the relationships we have with our parents.
Right.
Yeah, we talk a lot about at Kings Hill, gospel, community, and mission really being the backbone of our faith. But I think what's tricky is when you're on campus and you've been able to kind of create your own schedule, you kind of develop those rhythms of what gospel, how you're going to live out the gospel, how are you going to connect with community, how are you going to live out this mission of God. you've been able to work some of those rhythms out, but now you go home and there's a whole new set of rhythms that you're having to jump back into. It's like if you're playing jump rope on the, at recess, how do I hop back into that? What, what would some encouragements be for students that really have a heart for the gospel, really want to connect with community, want to live out God's mission, but now they're in a different context? How would you encourage them to live those essentials out when they're back home? Rachel, if you could maybe dive in.
Okay. Um, I think, and it differs if you're going home to Christian parents who align with everything that you believe, Christian parents who maybe don't, non-Christian parents, like it's, your situation's always going to be unique. But Matthew 5 talks about us being salt and light. And I think it's always important to remember, like when you go home, it's not like the light turns off and you become pepper. Like the command is still there. The promises are still there. You're still a Christian. So going home is not a vacation from being intentional. Especially if you're at a college church or college where you're really pushed to be missional and you're in great community, it's easy to feel like, oh, that's for there, and then home is for like putting my feet up. And I don't think that's the case. So if your family's not Christians, that doesn't mean you beat them over the head with the Bible. If they are Christians, it doesn't mean you debate every issue that you now are an expert on because you've gone to college. But I just think like entering the home with love, and if you're intentional with your time and your resources at college, it should be no different at home. And sometimes that looks like reconnecting with people that you grew up with. Sometimes it looks like helping your parents if they're actively involved in a church. And sometimes it does look like balancing staying connected with your church community from college and your church community where you grew up. But I think in any situation, like seek guidance from the people at your college church and your home church, because your college church community knows you the deepest, the most recently. But if you grew up in church, they've known you the longest. And I think both those perspectives are helpful.
That's a good word. The college church knows you most deeply recently, but the home church has known you the longest. And letting those voices be a balance into guiding about how to connect and really live out those rhythms. That's good, Rachel. RJ, how would you answer that? How would you give some encouragement, speak into that?
Yeah, so we kind of use a lot of language about family here, and so how that translates, into different aspects of life. And a big part of what we consider family language is this idea of what it means to abide. In Scripture, you see at the beginning of the story of redemption that He gives us, He calls out people and pretty much makes them be nomadic for centuries, right? But so where is their home? Where do they find home? Well, they abide in Him. And then you see that translate well into even in passages like John 15, where I'm the vine, you are the branches. There's this idea of abide in me, trust in me. And even later in that passage, talking about where the root of true love is. Well, the root of true love is abiding in Him. And so if I can abide in Him and I can be nomadic no matter what my context is, then I have that to go home to. And so when I'm returning home, if we can encourage our students to consider that, hey, the people that have invested in you there, they were also part of what's created your home in Christ. So how can you, and I like that she already mentioned this, I feel like you have my notes, Rachel. So, but just this idea of reconnecting with those relationships and rekindling some of those, if you have a solid home church, how can I plug back in there? How can I actually serve there while I'm home? And seeing that my mission is not contextual. My mission is not exclusive to a specific context. So I can come back home. I can actually even help be someone who implements new activities, new endeavors in my home context, whatever that may look like. But it's just that mentality of abiding and resting and trusting, because all of that, I think, is built into that word. Like you have this word picture of what it means to dwell with Christ. Well, I can dwell with Him no matter where I am. And so I want to do that when I'm going home. And so that community is built around that, right? And then obviously the community is invested in and entrusted to us because of the gospel, which leads us to mission. And so how can I maintain that moving forward? And that faith family can have people from every context you've ever been in, right? I mean, you can extend it to that. I mean, I think we're seeing that right now,
Yeah.
especially. And so a couple of things that come to mind for me when it comes to a student particularly would be from my college church, how can I maintain accountability with friends and spiritual friends and partners that I have that I'm not seeing currently? And so I can maintain those. I can invest in them still. that doesn't mean I'm not connected in my local context currently. It just means that I'm being bolstered by those people that aren't with me or not necessarily present in proximity. But I think actually having a plan when you're going home, and I know, I mean, I'm not a planner, not to that extent, but you know, we've done a lot of stuff about spiritual disciplines in this past year with our students, and how much discipline goes into being disciplined. Like
I had no
how can
kidding.
I, right? Like how do I prioritize this? Well, if you know you're going home, and granted the quarantine and our freshmen here at UA, they were given, I think, 36-hour notice before having to vacate. And so it was like, all right, well, you don't have plan to prioritize. Like you don't have time to plan. And so, but if you're going home for a break, and now that you're at home during your break a little early, I think being intentional to sit down and say, all right, I want these things to be part of my summer or my spring, whatever that break looks like. So how do I implement those well? It may sound way too boring and way too adult, but it's amazing how that helps us focus our minds and how that even can be worshipful. And so another thing I was thinking about is those relationships that you have with your home church. You rekindling is obviously there, but service opportunities, not even just at your home church, but in your own home. She mentioned it earlier, but how can you minister to your family? Maybe they aren't believers. So how can you be a sounding board for them? Like let them vent their frustrations with the church, and you be able to respond and say, well, do you see that in me? Right? I mean, like, look how Christ has changed me. Now I'm part of the church universal. I may not be part of the institutional church that you have issues with, but let us have conversation about that. So being able to minister to them, to their needs, is a huge thing too.
I love what you just said. One, seeing an opportunity to really be a Christ-like presence in your home,
Hmm.
and letting that be a part of the mission that you embrace. But even that word abide, I'm thinking about when I went home, it was my opportunity to sleep in. And so I would wake up super late. My parents would already be up, and they missed me, and so they had my day planned for me. They wanted, and it wasn't out of I want to control your schedule. It was just you've been gone for a long time, and I want to be with you. And so that spiritual discipline that you're talking about, if my relationships with my college church are going to be at its best, and if my relationships at home are going to be at its best, then I really got to find a way to connect with Jesus, because he's the one
Hmm.
that's going to influence all other relationships. And so it took that discipline of, before I leave the room, I got to have time with Jesus so that
Hmm.
my heart's in the right place to be who God's called me to be.
Yeah, that's good.
Uh, well, you guys have already really spoken into this, but just if you have any more just wisdom to share, I'd love to hear it. As a student goes home, what role should that college church play as they do go home, if any? But what would the role be of the college church as they go back home into their context? Rachel.
Um, I don't know that I feel really qualified to speak on this. I feel like it's another situation where I would talk to people at your church, your college church, and your home church, just seek guidance on it. But two of the things that I remember being especially tricky when I was in college, one feels small but can be really significant, is tithing.
Mm.
It's like, well, where am I supposed to give my money to if I go to this church like this many months a year and that church that many months a year? And I don't know if this is great for everyone, but what I did is I figured out how much I gave per month, divided it down per week, and then whatever church I was at that week, I just gave money every week instead of every month, which is more to keep track of. You probably don't need another thing on your plate, but I just felt like that was helpful because, especially if you grew up in the church that you might attend while at home, then it's like, well, they both poured into you. You're being fed by both. But I think if you're going home to a church environment, and I know that a lot of people aren't, one of the ways that I think you can be honoring to your parents is to attend with them, whether it's a perfect church or a church that you would attend on your own or not. I just think about if they were going to come visit me in Boston, I would want them to see this piece of my life. I would want them to meet the people that are investing in me, that I, and that, oh, excuse me, and that I spend time with. So doing that with them as well. But I think it's different if you're going home and you don't have a church to attend or your family is not Christians. Then
Mhm.
I think you would rely more heavily on your college church. But yeah, I would just talk to the people that are pouring into you, that are discipling you, and get their advice on it, because they're going to know your situation the best.
Love it. Love it. RJ.
Yeah, seriously, I think she stole all my notes. No, that was incredible. I think that's really great. And so, really, I'm a PK. Like I grew up in church, and so there was no context for me to have where I would be going home where church isn't part of that environment. But I will honestly tell you, being a minister's kid, my dad served rural churches in Northeast Florida, which were practically Southeast Georgia, and I did not connect with them at all. But I knew that I was expected to be there. There were a couple of summers where I was serving as an intern at another church, so they understood that they wanted me to pursue those ministerial opportunities. But man, Rachel, that was incredible. I mean, that's a great amount of wisdom there. But one thing that all of my experience has fed into is this idea of what does it mean to be part of the local body. And so for churches, I mean, I'm at a First Baptist church. I love it. It obviously has its challenges, and one of those is a lot of people who are drawn to First Baptist churches. And I'm being candid. I don't think it's the wrong thing. Um, Tend to have this sense of culture and tradition based on where they've come and the importance of what like a formal church membership looks like. And so in some students, even in the last 2 years, we've had really difficult conversations about, is your church membership an idol? And like, because they're not thinking about how they can serve locally. But above and beyond that, what's the inverse of that look like? Because I obviously think that we got a good thing going here, or I wouldn't be, as invested in what we're trying to do. But when we're sending them home, how do we want them to stay connected? Now, the quarantine is different, right? I mean, we've been trying to like give content and give connection because we want them to feel invested in during this in a very special way.
Mhm.
But so when you send that question, I was like, man, that is a good one. Because if I'm being honest with myself, I want them to be challenged to do exactly what we ask them to do when they come here, which is be present, be in proximity with the people that you're around. And so when it comes to the college church, I had this idea in my mind like, let us be a supplement to bolster you. Because I don't know Rachel's situation, but if it was like my family's church, it was not my preference, right? I mean, I love my dad, but I mean, it was 50 people in a country church, and we were singing hymns with a piano, and it just wasn't my preference.
Now,
But
easy to say, Rachel plays the piano.
hey, I love
I'm sitting
piano.
at
I'm
my
just saying,
piano right now, so
yeah.
watch it.
No, I love piano, but you understand what I'm saying. I'm coming
Yeah,
from a
totally.
college context where it's like, yeah, we use as many instruments as possible, even if we don't need them, because it's just we can. And plus, everybody was trying to get a date with somebody, so it was like, let me impress them with my musical skills. But when you come home, it's how that ministerial opportunity that you get to have with my parents in particular, who were ministers, because they were in a context where they were constantly pouring out. In some ways I kind of see their context similar to yours, Jonathan, where it's not urban but you're pouring out a lot, right? You're having to invest in a community a lot without much expectation for return other than hoping that the Lord's going to move. And so you have that plus 50 years of traditional church attached to that, where a lot of these people were cultural Christians, and had their preferences and had you saying, you know what, well, we tithe and thus we pay your salary, so you need to do what we ask you to do. So I had opportunity to invest in my parents and pray with them, and I should have done that more. But for me, I regret not being plugged into a local church in college. I was a BCM student. I loved my time at BCM, but it wasn't the church. And so I don't have that to look back on. But being a college pastor and understanding what it means to invest in them from a local church perspective, I know that we want to send them out. Right? It's kind of the same as being on mission. Like if we're living sent, then no matter what your context is, you are living on mission. And so let us be a supplement for you, but we don't want to be your primary content. And so I want you to serve and I want you to worship in your current context if possible. And the other thing for me is, do not compare and contrast both churches the whole time,
That's good.
wherever you are, because we know that there's no perfect church, right? And so no matter what your worship style preferences or any of those things, or even whether or not your local pastor is dynamic as your college pastor or college church pastor, um, what are they bringing to the table that is genuine, right? Like, what can I celebrate that Christ is doing through that person? And how can I be edified through that and challenged to serve in that local context? And the other part was just maintaining those connections to the people that you're close to. I mentioned it earlier, but I think your accountability, if you have people saying, hey, I know that you're going to be frustrated with your local church, I'm going to hold you accountable to where you're not like letting that frustration boil over, making sure that you can do that. especially if you have mentors in your college context.
Mm,
Allowing that voice of reason um, to kind of be that voice that maybe you're zooming with occasionally, or at least FaceTiming with or something. You're like, hey, this has been a hard week. But like Rachel said too, if you have a pretty dynamic, strong church home, who are the people that you used to be invested with that you can come back to and say, how can I help you invest in others now? There's just a lot of cool opportunity there.
that's great. Uh, a lot of wisdom from you guys. Thank y'all for just helping us think about how we can stay spiritually strong when we go home. So, Rachel, RJ, love the discussion today. Thank you again. And I hope to have people tune into this to listen. It's great. Good stuff. Thank you guys.
Thanks again for the opportunity.